friends, and welcome to another Ask ZAC. Today we're going to talk about Cornell Dupree. Got to turn the tremolo off on my amp so that don't hear that thumping the whole time. So just so you know, I'm got my telly and I'm going straight into the amp. No pick guard, going full on Dupree. So a bit of history. Cornell Dupree was born in Dallas in December of 1942. Of course, he learned how to play the guitar well enough that the great King Curtis Owsley, found him and convinced him to move to New York. And of course, he moved up there to play with King Curtis and the Kingpins. And wow, that's a great gig. And through that gig, he played with Bobby Womack some, because they were both playing with Sam Cooke for a bit. Played with Jimi Hendrix for a bit, continued to play with King Curtis, and really got his big break when he played on the tune I was playing at the beginning of the episode, A Rainy Night in Georgia, Brooke Benton's version. And of course, that's a Tony Joe White tune. And a quick aside, being that I'm from Kingsville, Texas, which is near Corpus Christi, Tony Joe White moved to Kingsville in the early 1960s, and my dad used to go see him play live. Said he was kind of an Elvis impersonator at the time. And then later in the 60s, while still living in the Kingsville, Corpus Christi area, he wrote Rainy Night in Georgia and Polk Salad Annie and some of those other tunes that appear on his early albums. So back to Mr. Dupree. Playing on Rainy Night in Georgia was a huge launch for him. And so soon he was playing on a lot of Atlantic sessions. King Curtis and the Kingpins started being Aretha Franklin's road band and studio band. And Jerry Wexler very famously said that he loved Cornell because he could hire him as the only guitar player on the session and have both lead and rhythm covered. In a lot of earlier Atlantic sessions, especially like if you think about the classic Aretha stuff, you had 2 or 3 guitar players on there. So you might have Jimmy Johnson and Bobby Womack and Joe South or Chips Moman, a mixture of those guys, playing on things. But Wexler loved Dupree's, kind of way that he could weave around both playing rhythm and lead and fills and such. Probably my favorite, besides Rainy Night in Georgia, he worked with Donny Hathaway, and they did the Donny Hathaway Live album, which I love that album. And there's a great, recently they put out a version of that's just the material with Dupree on it, because the original album is half Phil Upchurch, because part of it was cut in LA and part of it was cut, and both of it was cut live. But Phil Upchurch played on the LA stuff, and of course Cornell played on the New York stuff. Then you have Stuff with Eric Gale and Steve Gadd and Richard T. And you have the Joe Cocker things and all sorts of great stuff. Cornell was such a part of the New York establishment and continued to play in the clubs there. And what an amazing player and what an influential player. So that's kind of the nickel version of Cornell Dupree. I'm sad that of course he passed away a number of years ago, and I never got to interview him, email him, or anything like that. I certainly would have liked to have. I was dependent on research. I want to thank Michael Ross, my friend, and who's a writer for a Guitar Player and Premier Guitar, and he has a wonderful article on Cornell Dupree in his Forgotten Heroes series, and I'm going to put a link to that in the description. Also, there's this great book that called Rhythm and Blues Guitar by Cornell Dupree, also with Dave Rubin. And this is a great source because they did a good job of telling Cornell Dupree's story and having a lot of great information in that. So there's that. Let's talk a bit about his Cornell Dupree's gear, and then we'll talk some about his playing. So, of course, early on he played a variety of guitars, but by the time he's playing with King Curtis, he was playing a Guild guitar that had de-arming pickups. And in the Rhythm and Blues guitar book, he indicates that King Curtis was not happy with his guitar tone, and he ended up finding his sound with a Telecaster, and he got a Tele like this. So this is a 1967 Telecaster, and from the looks of his, it's a maple cap neck like mine, and I've taken the pick guard off in his honor, and it looks like he had either a 67 or 68 Tele, and this is what he used, unmodified on like Rainy Night in Georgia and the Aretha stuff. It seems later on he added a de-arming pickup, and there was an added little plate here, and the plate had a selector switch to turn the pickup off and on. And that guitar is, as far as I can tell, it seems to be owned by a collector in Japan. So that's where his original late 60s Telecaster is. Of course, after playing the Tele, he played a series of Yamaha signature models until Cornell Dupree's passing. The strings he used are interesting, and I've gone so far as to replicate the set that he used, but for the time it was not unusual. So Cornell Dupree used what was called Fender rock and roll strings. So the standard string at that point was like 12 through 50 something and had a wound third. Well, Ernie Ball started making strings in 62, and Fender started offering a light gauge set that they called their rock and roll set, and it was interesting, and that's what Dupree used. And so it's 10 for the high string, 13 for the B string, 15 for the G string. Okay, we're going to talk more about that later. 26 for the D string, 32 for the A string, and 38 for the low E string. So now this was the set, and so this is the set that Jimi Hendrix used. It's a set that Duane Allman and Eric Clapton, Roy Buchanan, Danny Gatton, on and on and on. This was kind of like the easy to get light gauge string set, and it's kind of what everyone used. And so you have the gauges that are kind of wacky by today's standards, but they were standard at the time. Then also the construction method is different. Now the unwound strings are the same as what we use now, but the wound strings are different. These are round core, which means the core of the string is round, and then it has a solid nickel wrap on it. Now how that's different is today's strings are hex core, and they have nickel plated steel. So what that means is the hex core helps the wind stay on there better, and then the nickel plated steel has more output. So the strings that our heroes used are quite different than what we're using now. The strings we're using now have more bass output. They're louder. So I changed to the set, and this is, of course, Fender is not making those strings anymore. This is a recreation made by Pyramid, and I'll put a link to these also. And they even call it the Jimi Hendrix inspired set. And again, it's 10, 13, 15, 26, 32, 38. So there you have it. So while we're still on gear, of course, Cornell mainly used Fender amps. I'm sure New York is kind of known, especially in the 60s and 70s. There were a lot of Ampeg amps at studios, and I'm sure he probably used those also. But he was known for using a Fender Twin, live, or Showman, or whatever kind of amp there was. So now let's talk about his playing. And since we just kind of covered gear, let's talk about how those strings affected his playing. Well, of course, you have kind of a lightish kind of low end, and then you have this really, fairly light G string. Well, if you listen to Cornell's, soloing, like you'll hear more of it like on the Donny Hathaway live album, and maybe on some of the like the Aretha Live at the Fillmore, you hear some of it, but you'll notice that he will bend more wildly, on that G string. And, it's pretty obvious that he was, influenced some by Albert King. And so you'll hear these bends where, let's say he's playing in the key of A, and it's a pretty common move to take that C note on the G string and bend it up a half step to a C sharp. So it's kind of a minor third, major third bend. But Cornell will bend a lot from the C to the D. So, you get that whole step bend, and he's doing it seemingly with his first finger. So you get this kind of thing. So you get, so you have that, or you have these kind of whole, and he would do some double string bends and things like that. So that's something that was influenced by, the string gauge that he was using. Another thing, of course, you have the kind of double stop things like, like on Rainy Night in Georgia, which was actually, I played it in E, the original's in D, so you have that. That kind of thing. Another thing he's kind of really known for is playing like these sixths and then kind of hitting, like again, we'll stay in the key of A just to make it easy, but he would like, and then hit the tonic. So it's a fairly common move, for Mr. Dupree. And that's a great thing. You can do it other ways, but you kind of lose that high note. So it sounds better if you don't. And of course he did the normal kind of double stops things and rhythm, and he was kind of known for the Cornell bounce. Also, it's funny, a lot of that stuff, people got credit for things they didn't play, and no offense to Cornell Dupree at all, but he got credit for playing, for originating the part on, Memphis Soul Stew. Well, Reggie Young came up with that part and recorded it originally, but Cornell certainly, played it great and played it a little different. And of course, he had his own kind of rhythm thing that he did. So, so that kind of thing. Yeah. So those are just some little bit of Cornell Dupree isms. Also, I wanted to talk about one of the things I think is real interesting is just that nexus of rhythm and blues kind of soul guitar players, and how you find out that they were all hanging out and they were all, kind of rubbing off on each other. And in this rhythm and blues guitar book that I mentioned earlier, Cornell talks about playing on Rainy Night in Georgia and saying that the influence, what influenced him to play like that was Curtis Mayfield. So I've done a couple other, episodes on, kind of R&B guitar players like, Bobby Womack and Reggie Young, and I didn't mention Curtis Mayfield, and I kind of thought, well, he used that different, tuning where it was F sharp and but no, he was a huge influence, and I should have mentioned him on other things. But so, yeah, so Bobby Womack and Curtis Mayfield and and Cornell Dupree and Jimi Hendrix. I mean, all those guys were rubbing off on each other, and I guess really Curtis Mayfield was kind of influencing those guys more than he was being influenced. But yeah, Cornell gives due credit to Curtis Mayfield for the stuff that he played on Rainy Night in Georgia. Yeah, I just think that's really interesting. Again, Cornell Dupree playing with Jimi Hendrix, Bobby Womack and Cornell Dupree playing with Sam Cooke, and on and on. So it's a fun thing, and I love that kind of soul guitar kind of thing, and yeah. So that's kind of my take on Cornell Dupree. Love him, love his playing. I'm going to create a Spotify playlist, and and kind of choose my favorite Cornell Dupree things, from through the years. I have to admit that, again, that Donny Hathaway live album is a favorite. So anyway, yeah. So take your pick guard off, plug straight into your amp. You don't need any effects. Of course, every once in a while he'd do volume swells with the volume control and stuff like that. But yeah, enjoy. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks. Bye-bye.